Hi folks, and welcome back to Conveyancing. This is video 5 in the video series on seller's disclosure, and I promise this will be the very last and very short, hopefully, video in this series. You will remember that in videos 1 through 4 we looked at the seller's disclosure obligations at law, under statute, and most of what the seller needs to disclose under the REIQ standard terms. We looked at the seller's warranties in the last video, and now we just need to cover off property adversely affected. Once again, because it's a bit nicer, I think I'll take you to the contract itself in all its glory so we can get a feel for it. And here we are back at the contract itself, and you'll see 7.7 is the one we're interested in today. If at the contract date, and then you have any of these subparas A through H, you skip down to the bottom there, and that has not been disclosed in this contract, the buyer may terminate by notice to the seller given on the settlement date or before the settlement date. So any of this stuff crops up anywhere between contract and settlement, then the buyer will be able to terminate. I did mention at the very last video, end of the last video, the sneaky little clause 7.4 sub 5, the seller doesn't warrant the present use is lawful, and I said it does tie in with property adversely affected. Now if you look at 7.71a, it says the present use is not lawful under the relevant town planning scheme. So if at the contract date that is the case, then the buyer may terminate. What does that mean, and how does that exactly tie in with 7.4 sub 5? The way that it ties in is this. After contracting, generally in Queensland, the buyer will go ahead and do all of their searches, and that will include things like town planning schemes. If the buyer finds out that in fact this clause has not been satisfied and the present use is not lawful, obviously under 7.7 sub 1 sub A they may terminate. However, if the buyer does not terminate under 7.71a after finding out about unlawful use, then they will be taken to accepted the property subject to that unlawful use, and they can't turn around and have a swing at the seller because the seller has not warranted that the present use is lawful, so they can't sue the seller for damages there. So that's how those two provisions work in together. The next one, 7.71b, is where the land's affected by a proposal of an authority to alter the dimensions of any transport infrastructure or locate transport infrastructure on the land. Most of the squabbles around this provision have been because there's been some uncertainty as to whether the notice that's the proposal that's been discovered in relation to transport infrastructure is something short of an officially endorsed proposal by the local authority. And you know, these things don't just come about overnight, generally speaking. If the authority is going to change dimensions of transport infrastructure or encroach on somebody's land, there will normally be discussions around the issue, and then those discussions will progress somewhat. They may go through certain levels of meetings, and there may be a final meeting and final approval for the transport infrastructure. Now, where in that process does the proposal to do something here become a proposal for the purposes of 7.71b? There's a number of different cases that the text discusses for you there. I'll leave you to flesh those out for yourself, but that's just something you need to be aware of. Often it's not clear cut when exactly land has been affected by these things, and you'll need to fossick around and see what stage of approval the proposal is at to see whether your buyer can effectively exit the contract for breach of 7.71b. The next subpara, C, deals with access to the land or access for any service to the land, if that passes unlawfully through other land and you find that your land is somehow unfortunately legally landlocked, you can't get to it or services can't get to it, then this will allow the buyer to exit the contract. There is some remedy under the Property Law Act for landlocked owners to try and impose user rights to reasonably access their property, but if that's all too much of a headache, which I would hazard a guess is probably the case in 99% of cases, then once you find that out, you can exit the contract under 7.71c. 7.71d deals with resumptions, and this is a big one. Obviously, as a buyer, you don't want to purchase the property and then find out that it's been subject to a notice to resume. Calls to mind the Castle movie, doesn't it?
And they're going to take our place and we don't get a say in it.
You really don't want to be entering into that kind of a scenario. So you can exit under 7.71d. Notice I will flag one thing with 7.71d. If the contract has been signed and the notice of resumption then issues between contract and settlement, obviously because the property has transferred its risk over to the buyer, then the buyer will be at risk of the resumption according to the notice. So that's just something to remember for 7.71d. 7.71e deals with outstanding conditions of development approvals under various pieces of legislation, which, if complied with, would constitute a material mistake or omission in the seller's title. Obviously, if there are serious conditions like that outstanding, you probably want to exit the contract, and that is exactly what E allows you to do. 7.71F deals with heritage listing. You might think this is a bit quirky if you haven't had much to do with real property matters or conveyancing before. You might think that's a bit quirky. I can tell you what, in Brisbane, the higher end property, if you have to do conveyancing for higher end properties, this will often crop up because some of the really valuable property in Brisbane is fairly old and is subject to listing on the various different heritage registers. If the buyer finds out that the property is listed, it can make the property much less attractive to purchase because it's going to be a pain in the neck if you have to actually renovate the property or change it around to your liking. Then you're going to have to run through all of your plans and dreams with the relevant authorities before you can get those approved and to go ahead with them. So that is the heritage issue under 7.71F. The next legislation that the buyer may encounter in their various searches of the property is that the property is affected under the Queensland Reconstruction Authority Act. That legislation was introduced in 2011 after the terrible floods at the very beginning of 2011, where the government realised that for the purposes of recovering from disasters like that and reconstructing the state, they may well need to acquire various pieces of land. If this is the case, then the Reconstruction Authority has to give notice that the land has been declared acquisition land to both the owner and also the Land Titles Office. So any searches should show this kind of thing against the property's title. Once land has been declared acquisition land, obviously if the government's considering acquiring it, then the owner cannot dispose of that land to anybody else but the relevant authority. So fairly significant restrictions on the property there. If the property is sold contrary to one of these restrictions and despite being declared acquisition land, the contract won't be invalid, but there are penalties all around. The seller will cop a penalty for disposing of the land contrary to the legislation. The incoming buyer will take subject to the notification that this is acquisition land, and the buyer also will not be able to dispose of the land to anyone else but the relevant authority. So yet another salient lesson in terms of buyers getting their searches done quickly after contract, having a good look at them, and if anything like this crawls out of the woodwork, then utilising 7.7 as you need to do so. The lucky last is 7.71H, and that deals with charges against the land under the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act. We'll be looking at foreign acquisitions a little later on in the unit, so I'm not going to go into that here really. So that's 7.7, and that is the seller's disclosure obligations under the RERQ standard terms. As always, if you have any queries or questions, please shoot me an email or contact me on Teams or via Moodle. Other than that, I look forward to chatting with you and hopefully catching up with you in an upcoming Zoom. So until then, bye for now, guys.